let's start, of course, with Kyle McCord. And I think he could have a big year for Syracuse football next year. A little bit of background about McCord. He is 6'3", 210 pounds. He is a former 5-star high school recruit to Ohio State. He was the backup there in 2021 and 2022 to C.J. Stroud. Of course, then C.J. Stroud moves on to the NFL. And last year, McCord becomes the full-time starter, where he started 12 games for the Buckeyes. And in those 12 games, he had about 3,200 passing yards, 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and a completion percentage of 66%, which is pretty good. And overall, he had a top 10 QBR in the nation last season. And I project, as many of you probably expect as well, that McCord, a 4-star transfer this offseason, one of the first players that Fran Brown brought in, is going to be the starting quarterback for next year for Syracuse football. He was the starter in the spring game. If anything changes, well, that's probably not a good thing, but Kyle McCord projected to be the starter for next year. He is going into his last season of eligibility. So it's a one-and-done type deal with Kyle McCord as the Syracuse football quarterback. Here is why I think that McCord could have a big year for Syracuse football next season. Number one, he's got Big Ten level experience. Big Ten football, let's be 100% honest with ourselves. It's better than the ACC. I think we can all agree on that, right? The Big Ten football is better than the ACC. This ain't basketball. This is football. Those schools in the Big Ten, like Ohio State and Michigan, and even the next tier of schools, would be very, very good in the ACC. So the Big Ten, a deeper, tougher conference than the ACC. Those schools tend to get better athletes in high school. The speed is different in the Big Ten. And overall, I think it's the second best conference in college football behind the SEC. I don't think there's even a comparison with any other conference to the SEC. I think the SEC is on its own island, but then the Big Ten is next. Consider the Big Ten like a subset island of the main island of the SEC. But the ACC is not the SEC. And McCord started 12 games last year at Ohio State, Big Ten, of course, and he handled himself pretty well. Obviously, top 10 quarterback or top 10 QBR in the country, 24 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. He was pretty good. All right, pretty good at Ohio State in the Big Ten. Obviously, the ACC is a little bit easier, which leads me to reason number 2 of why I think Kyle McCord could be an all-ACC quarterback for next season. He has less weapons on the team this year, but he's going against easier competition, right? So let's just, again, be honest with ourselves. I know we love to live in our Syracuse bubble and think all of our players are the best and everything like that, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we also have to be honest with ourselves. Last year, Kyle McCord was throwing to guys like Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka. Yeah, Syracuse football, I like their weapons they have, right? Aronde Gadsden, Dan Villari at tight end is really, really strong. We talked about the receivers last week on the podcast, led by Zeed Haynes, Jackson Meeks, Justice Ross Simmons. I keep saying Justin, but it's Justice Ross Simmons. It's a good weaponry, and you got LaQuinn Allen in the backfield, of course, and more. I don't want to leave out anybody, but at the same time, we don't have all day here. But the point being, Kyle McCord has some weapons, but there's no Marvin Harrison. There's no Emeka Egbuka on here. Those are some of the elite players in college football. Marvin Harrison might be the best wide receiver prospect to come out in the last 20 years. Okay? That's how good he had it last year at Ohio State. So while he doesn't have those same weapons, he does have easier competition to go against. Syracuse does not play against Clemson or Florida State. Those are the 2 toughest teams in the ACC year in and year out, essentially. The toughest opponent is probably Miami, but I would say Miami is pretty comparable to the teams that McCord had to face, aside from, of course, Michigan. But McCord also had to face teams like Notre Dame and Penn State, really, really solid programs. Some are more storied than others. Syracuse doesn't quite have the tough schedule like Ohio State typically does, being in the Big Ten. So those type of schools, a Notre Dame, a Penn State, a Michigan, you can look up Kyle McCord's numbers. They weren't like earth-shattering in those games, but that's the point. Those games, they can weigh your numbers down a little, right? You're gonna do well against the nobodies, and then against the big boys, it's a little bit tougher, obviously. And this year with Kyle McCord being in the ACC, and the fact that Syracuse doesn't have to play Clemson or Florida State, he's got more games against lesser competition than he had last season. So let's now move on to reason number 3 of why I think Kyle McCord can be an all-ACC quarterback next season. And that's the fact, and it's the fact that he, I believe, is blamed for something he cannot control himself. What do I mean by that? The last 3 quarterbacks at Ohio State before Kyle McCord was the full-time starting quarterback: C.J. Stroud, Justin Fields. That's actually Justin right there. Justin Fields and Dwayne Haskins. Let me repeat. C.J. Stroud, Justin Fields, Dwayne Haskins. Those were the last 3 starting quarterbacks at Ohio State before Kyle McCord. Those 3 quarterbacks all have something in common. They were first-round NFL draft picks. Not only that, they were in the top 20. I don't exactly remember where Dwayne Haskins went. He was the lowest of the 3 taken, but even then, I believe he was top 20 in the NFL draft. Those guys put up legitimate Heisman Trophy seasons and lit the world on fire in college football. Okay? Kyle McCord last year, I said his numbers, 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. It's not comparable to the guys that came before him. I believe that there is this perception of Kyle McCord not being a good quarterback or not being a very good quarterback. I think most people would think he's solid. But there's kind of this negative perception around McCord because he wasn't one of the guys that were before him. But let's just be, again, like, he wasn't a first-round NFL talent. He wasn't a top 20 NFL talent. I know he had great weapons. But I'm telling you, when we get to the backup quarterbacks for Syracuse football, you can't just plug anyone into that system and expect that they're going to do well. Okay? And Kyle McCord, it's not like he had a bad year last year. He was pretty good. I don't think he elevated the talent around him, but I don't think he weighed the talent down around him. Ohio State still went 11-1 in the regular season. They didn't go 11-1 because Kyle McCord was terrible and they had to carry him over the finish line. They went in 11-1 in part because Kyle McCord was a pretty solid starting Big Ten quarterback for Ohio State. So there's this perception about him not being elite, not being very good, whatever you want to say, because he wasn't the guys that came before him. I believe that next season, if Kyle McCord put up the exact same numbers as he did last year, 3,200 yards, 20-ish touchdowns, 6 interceptions, around a 65% completion rate, if he put up similar numbers to last year, this year for Syracuse football, people are going to think much differently of him. They're going to be like, wow, Kyle McCord is a pretty good quarterback. Look at him go at Syracuse. But it's the same numbers. It's the same guy. Lesser weapons, but easier competition. But that's my point. The perception of Kyle McCord, because of what he wasn't, like his predecessors, is why people think he might not be very good. But I do think he is pretty good, and he is going to have a very solid year for Syracuse football next season. Overall, I think Kyle McCord is an upgrade on Garrett Shrader. I've documented that before here on this podcast. I think he gives the team more upside than Garrett Shrader. Garrett Shrader gave the team a solid floor, right? You knew with Garrett Shrader they'd win at least 5 games in the regular season. He would do really well against the lesser competition. But once he faced a little bit stronger competition, Schrader just really couldn't keep up, in my opinion. He just wasn't that type of player to be able to handle some of the elite teams in the country. We saw it every week when Syracuse had to go against a team that was a little bit, there was a difference between Florida State and Boston College. Let's just put it that way. All right. Schrader's numbers would take a hit in those type of games. I think that with Kyle McCord, you get a little bit more upside against teams that might be a little bit better. So the upside is there with the floor still being there as well. So there's more ceiling with Kyle McCord than Garrett Schrader. I wouldn't say that Kyle McCord is going to be first team All-ACC next season, although I do think it's possible. If he has a really, really strong year, he could be first team All-ACC. But I certainly think he can make a conference team. The last quarterback to make a conference team for Syracuse football, of course, is Eric Dungey in 2018 when Syracuse football went 10-3. And Dungey that year made third team. Can Kyle McCord do that? I think so. I think Kyle McCord is probably the best quarterback Syracuse has had, at least since Eric Dungey. If not, you can go further back. So Syracuse football, I think because of Kyle McCord, has a higher upside this season than it has in many other years. But hopefully he stays healthy, because coming up, we're going to talk about the backup quarterbacks on Syracuse football.